So hello, everyone. It's been nice to get to know a lot of you. I think a lot of you are new faces for me. There's definitely a confluence of people from different disciplines and different kind of period focuses. So I've been really enjoying meeting people who are doing classics, people who are in religion departments. Um, I am in an English department, and I work on more contemporary literature and some late 19th century material. I'll be talking about some of that today. And just quickly, here's some of the things I'll be kind of trying to cover in my 15 minutes. So I want to talk about open access issues. I want to allude to what I think of as the politics of archive building. Um, and I think also the kind of the my sort of preference to take the political premises and the kind of questions of access and the questions of, I guess you could say, the politics of representation as something that I think of as the core of what I'm doing, not a secondary or afterthought in terms of building archives. And I'll give a brief introduction to my Kipling's project as well. So yeah, I mentioned I teach in an English department. I'm really kind of most focused on post-colonial literature and cinema of diaspora, migration. I have a book coming out on Mira Nair this year. And I've been doing, I think I would think of myself as a part-time DH person, somebody who's started really doing it kind of more intensively in recent years. And the British Raj interest that is in my Kipling's project really came out of teaching. So I would assign, a book by Kipling, like Kim, and then think, okay, there's not really good resources here to explain and contextualize all the things that are happening here. Maybe we need a digital resource that can do that. And that's kind of what I began to play with the Kipling's. And specifically, I chose the Scalar platform, and I'll talk a little bit about why as we get a little further forward. All right, so one thing I wanted to put on the table, it is a roundtable, and so I know some of you are involved in copyright issues and in questions about how to think about and frame access in digital projects. I mean, my small rant or polemic about this is that we don't have enough open access with regard to primary sources in South Asian materials. So I've been working with some South Asian newspapers from the 19th century. Some of those have been digitized and are available via Redex, but most of them are highly restricted in terms of what you can do with them, and they also lack any useful metadata. And so a lot of the new kinds of questions people are asking, the new methods people are using in digital humanities scholarship, where you take large corpora, right? You take tens of thousands of texts, and you ask certain questions about what's in those texts, the nature of the language in those texts. You do text analysis. You can't do any of that with the masses of newspapers that have been digitized, Indian newspapers that have been digitized and that are available on things like Redex right now in the World Newspaper Archive. So what I would love to see us have, what I wish we had, was a metadata-rich, open access digital archive of 19th century South Asian print materials in English as well as South Asian languages, preferably led by a nonprofit agency or educational organization, right? So one of the biggest problems, I think, is that a lot of these are for-profit companies. Even the microfilm makers are for-profit companies. So there's the microfilms. If you want to see the paper that Rudyard Kipling wrote for, the Civil and Military Gazette, you can get that on microfilms at research libraries. But again, that microfilm is proprietary, right? I can't digitize all of that and just make that public on an archive. I need to pay that company, $20,000 to be able to do that. So nonprofit educational institutions, it's urgent for us to begin to take control of that material and begin to own it and use it really, and think of it as something that is there not for profit, but for education and for learning. In my own project, I wanted to make it a point from the very beginning not to simply build a neutral collection where my goal would be to just simply provide a comprehensive array of texts for people to access however they wanted. There are already many collections out there that digitize materials without giving any indication that the materials have been read by a human being, right? So people will just put forward, hundreds or thousands of texts in a big corpus, and they're all there. They're by number, right? And there's not a sense there that there's been a person who curated them, who thought that certain ones were more important than others. I think the makers of digital collections should underline, first, why are these materials interesting to readers? Why would anybody care about this today? Thematic navigation guides. So if somebody finds your archive and they were looking for, let's say, a poem that Walt Whitman wrote about slavery, are there more poems by Walt Whitman that deal with slavery, right? The Walt Whitman archive is one of the most kind of preeminent archives in the digital humanities space and literature, and there's no there's no interest in that, right? They have all that material there, but if you wanted to know about white women in slavery, you would really have to know what you were looking for to get at that in their digital collection. For me, I want to approach it the opposite way. There's something here about social reform in India in the 1880s that Rudyard Kipling wrote about. If somebody wanted to know more about that, I wanted to make it a clear path for people to be able to find that material. Finally, limited but useful and user-friendly is better than comprehensive and lifeless, right? So it's thinking about the readers, thinking about the users, often from the point of view of students or amateurs, people who are not specialists. What will they do with this? How can they use this? How will they find what they're looking for? Will they understand what they're seeing? Second part of this story. In the South Asian context, it seems necessary to acknowledge the colonial and potentially neo-colonial relations of power that have shaped our knowledge of the Indian subcontinent. This means being willing to acknowledge that my primary subjects could be at times ignorant about South Asian culture, at times deeply biased. We shouldn't be afraid if we're creating an archive of the Kipling family's writing to say that Rudyard Kipling was a racist at times, right? And to actually have that be something that we can acknowledge and can work with, as opposed to either apologize for or kind of sideline, right? It's also important, I think, for me to bring in Indian interlocutors and think about Indian users of the site today. Right? So this was partly inspired by thinking about the Kipling family that lived in India for all these years, but I wasn't just interested in them qua the Kiplings. I was interested in the whole social picture of India in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and I wanted to find Indian voices to be part of that conversation. And one more thing before I show you a little bit about the site itself. I have been interested in an idea that I call the archive gap. So as I've been looking at newspapers from the period on microfilm and on Redex, as I mentioned before, I came to learn that newspapers in South Asian languages are much less well represented than our English language newspapers with British colonial editors and publishers. So if you're looking for the 19th century print run of the Allahabad Pioneer, and you go to Redex, it's comprehensive. You can know what happened on any given day in 1887, and you have that. You'll get that. You'll be able to call that PDF right up. If you were looking at Punjabi language newspapers, as I began to do because they lived in Lahore, they were in a Punjabi context. There are some archives of those. There's a site called the Punjab Digital Library, which has some of that material, but it's super fragmentary. You'll get one day in a month, maybe, that was preserved and so you might have maybe 30 fragments from the entire 20-year run of that newspaper. So Khalsa Akhbar, for instance, that's one that's on Punjab Digital Library. It's very fragmentary. So for me, what that means is not that therefore we focus on the Allahabad Pioneer, which was edited by British colonial kind of figure, and therefore we can't work on the Khalsa Akhbar. For me, it means putting a lot of time and effort into thinking about what we can do with the materials we have that are in South Asian languages, right? So in a way, it means that I want to emphasize those things all the more because they are so fragmentary. And that's a way of kind of balancing the tendency in Indian history and Indian literary history to really privilege British colonial voices over Indian voices, right? So I want to kind of try and correct that. And so for me, the umbrella term for this whole problem that I'm talking about is the archive gap. There's a gap in what we have access to and not only what we have access to, but what we've decided to do with what we have access to in the past. All right, so my own project, and how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, thank you. The Kiplings in India, a collection of writings from British India, 1870 to 1900. And as I've been already alluding, I started out really thinking of it as a thematic collection focused on the writing by this family from its Indian years. So originally I was working to digitize works by not just Rudyard Kipling, but Lockwood Kipling, his father, Alice Kipling Fleming, who was his sister and an accomplished novelist in her own right. And most of her novels, she published 3 novels. They're really not accessible. They're out of print. They aren't available. She wrote short stories. Alice MacDonald Kipling, Rudyard's mother, was also an accomplished poet. A surprising number of their especially writings that are from the 1880s from their family are collaborative. That Rudyard wrote many of his early short stories together with his sister, and that was a story that hadn't really been kind of worked through in the criticism, so I wanted to try and use the site to try and tell that story. And I do have a plan. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but Alice Kipling Fleming, I have 2 of her novels that I've been working on digitizing and creating digital editions of. So I have short stories by her, but not the full novels yet. And what began to happen, that was really stage one of the project, the Kipling family. As I began to get into it, and I already kind of alluded to the idea that I wanted Indian interlocutors, I began to get kind of deeper and deeper into that and really think, what's the story, what are the stories that I want to tell from this period? And so some of the major themes that I started to research more deeply and think about how to kind of bring those voices in, the Indian National Congress that emerged in the 1880s, the debates that were happening over the status of women, including widow remarriage, the age of consent, the rights of women within marriage, rights to divorce, debates about the responsibility of the British administration in light of some of the very severe famines that were occurring in British India in the especially the 1870s and the 1890s. And finally, the religious reform movements that were occurring. And so Lahore was a major hub for many of these, right? So there's the Arya Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj, the Singh Sabha movement. These were all talked about in the British newspapers. And I wanted to kind of find the full picture. I wanted to find the Indian voices that were on the other side of that as well. So I began to, in the second stage, I began to digitize not just works by the Kiplings, but these Indian interlocutors that I was alluding to. So I've been putting up materials from Pandita Ramabai, who was kind of a very important figure at that time. She was an Indian feminist, a Christian convert, an advocate of women's education. And she wrote a really powerful memoir about her experiences in the famine of 1876 that I thought was a really interesting counterpoint to what Lockwood Kipling had written about it. Rukmabai, who had been forced into marriage as a child but sued for divorce as an adult, and her case was widely debated in the English language newspapers. Dadabai Naoroji, pioneer of the Indian National Congress, Florence Nightingale. And so on my site, what's beginning to emerge, this is a tree of content from one part of my site. It's not just the Kiplings. It really is, there are full subheaders and sections where you can research those particular topics and dive more deeply. There's an array of authors that includes the Kiplings, but also a number of the other figures that I mentioned. So it really is just, I've really tried to design it so that you can access different parts of the story that you might be interested in. If you're not interested in the Kiplings and you really want to study Rukmabai, there actually are not many sites on the internet that have material about Rukmabai other than Wikipedia. So my site could be a place where you could learn about Rukmabai. That's the idea. And one or two more things. I think I'm about done. The archive gap with, let's say that with the famine in particular, I mentioned this already a little bit. Lockwood Kipling, did mention it somewhat in his early journalism, mostly though in the 1870s with regard to charitable social events in Bombay, right? So he wouldn't have experienced the actual full force of those famines in the 1870s by actually being in the South where they were really kind of hitting hardest. So he was talking about the parties that people were holding to raise money to support people in the famine. Rudyard Kipling lived in India for a long time. India was one of the biggest components of his career. It's what made him famous, where he rose to fame through that. And he never really, during this entire period, wrote anything about the famines. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't talk about them. He has one story from the 1890s that deals with the famine, with the famines in India, the day's work. And so what I wanted to do, thinking about my own project, was I wanted to use my project to mark that omission and to fill in that archive gap with documentation and to consider the implications of that omission, right, to kind of make it a part of my story. The final thing I would say, this is my last slide. The larger aim of my project has been to produce a different kind of digital thematic research collection, one that doesn't put politics and ideology on the back burner, but instead brings the issues of coverage and canonicity to the forefront. Can an archive also be a resource that gives users the ability to critique its subject? Can an archive announce and embrace its own limits, not as a source of weakness, but as evidence of alternative, counter-canonical narratives? By foregrounding supplementary texts by Indian writers not directly connected to the Kipling, this collection aims to demonstrate and perform its own limit, to recognize the Kiplings, but also go beyond them. Thank you.